everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Feel free to turn on your camera. Let there be light in the Stoa. You won't be recorded unless you ask a question. And today we have the good people from Life Itself here with us. The co-founder Rufus Pollock, who's also the author of The Open Revolution, and head of delivery Theo Cox. And so what is Life Itself? From their website, they're pragmatic utopians. We're committed to a practical action for a wiser, radically wiser, weller world. We create hubs, do research, and engage in advocacy to pioneer a wiser culture. That is from their website. And they had this really cool project charting Metamodern, the ecosystem. And so they have this really cool chart, and they have a website with all the sort of like the players and collaborators in this emerging space that are kind of oriented towards a societal change in a holistic way. So I'll take in Rufus and Theo in a moment, and they'll kind of introduce themselves, explain the project, and then we'll have an open conversation. And during the Q&A portion, if you have any questions anytime, actually just put them in the chat, and then I'll call on you. You can ask your questions to either Rufus or Theo. So that being said, welcome, gentlemen, to the Stoa.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, really good to be here, Peter. Great. Should we just kick off and just explain a little bit about the project then? Would that be the best way to start, I think?
Yeah, sounds good.
So, yeah, Theo, do you want to bring up just share the kind of website maybe, and I'll talk a bit to it. So I mean,
I certainly can.
for a little bit of context, for just maybe a tiny bit of more information about like Life Itself, we're, as Peter said, you know, we're a community.
There's a sound. Yeah. Am I the only one hearing that? There was like a lot of
yeah, there was quite a lot of feedback just then.
Yeah, buzzing. I think it's from your mic, Rufus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's from yours. It's going on and off at various degrees.
Let me try switching just very. Let me see if I switch microphone, if that's any better. Is that any better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Who knows what it was? Okay, so just Life Itself, we're an organization. We've been around since 2015, and we're very interested in paradigmatic or like radical social kind of improvement, change. We're pragmatic utopians, we say. So big visions, but also very practical steps to get there. And maybe I just want to start, before I introduce the website, maybe with a kind of metaphorical kind of analogy here that kind of sets the scene for some of this, which is, if you think about something that we're all familiar with, like environmentalism, or you know, sustainability. At some point, you know, if we went back 30 or 40 years and I said my car is green, you'd know what I meant was my car was painted green. Whereas today, if you say your car is green, it means it's environmentally friendly. And that's maybe just one, it's a tiny example, or just the fact, if probably went back 60 years and I said I'm big on sustainability, or I'm part of the environmental movement, you wouldn't know what that meant. And there's now a self-conscious, defined movement around something called environmentalism or sustainability. So one of the things that kind of happens in it, that we see in history, is that kind of change movement at some point are kind of almost undefined. They're amorphous. Maybe there's different groups. There's groups who are into, I don't know, veganism, or people who are interested into protecting natural spaces, or the other people who are concerned about chemicals in the water. And at some point, these different groups, who in some ways have some common interests, but maybe very different language, coalesce into something that's, they don't necessarily merge, but there's a kind of coalescing, at least in their own self-consciousness and the consciousness of the wider society around that. That kind of, it's a movement, a coherent movement that before was certainly a sentence of disparate actors. And one of the points in the background of this exercise is, say, and it's even around the term, like we've ended up picking Metamodern, Anna Schaffner, who's a collaborator with us on the project from Emerge, couldn't make it, unfortunately, today to this call. we had a big debate about the naming. Is it even metamodern? Like, one of the difficulties when we first had the project was just like mapping XXX. What is the name of this emerging ecosystem? What is the name of this emerging movement? And Metamodern is just a placeholder. I want to emphasize that because I know that there are different names out there: the liminal web, the kind of the meta movement. There's a variety of ones. We mention it in the introductory essay that like we kind of mapped about like 5 or 6, 7 different names. So what this project here at Concrete is about is it's trying to like help start delineating that, starting to help map it, and starting with the organizations. I mean, the starting point maybe to scroll down is actually just a list of the organizations that sort of in this space that we've begun collecting along with Emerge and other collaborators on a snowball sampling site basis. And we very much welcome suggestions for other organizations. We know we've definitely missed off many maybe that should be on there. It's got geographic biases, it's got thematic biases, but this is the starting point, was this kind of profile list. We now have about 100 organizations on there, and not all of them yet fully shown on the website because we have to do some analysis for each one we add. And then we kind of, the really interesting question also starts to come up is like, what defines with what even defines with an organization, what is an organization that's sort of connected to this ecosystem and what isn't? And that even brings up questions like, how do we start to define it? And also what should it be called? So I don't know, Theo, if there's anything you want to add to that contextual introduction to the project, which is, what is this emerging movement? What are its features? What are its principles?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the thing that I would add, and this speaks a little bit more broadly to why we're up to this, which is something that we can go into a little more detail, is that we think there's huge practical value and utility from not only sort of engaging in this mapping and collecting these organizations together, but also beginning to undertake this analysis of kind of, where are the bounds of this ecosystem, and what might kind of lead us to consider an organization sort of or actor, etc., part of it versus not. And I can speak a little bit more to this more broadly. I think I'll save what that utility might be for the introduction, but just to kind of précis that, we think that there's this kind of giving self-awareness to this ecosystem can be incredibly valuable in improving sort of coherence, strategic alignment, collaboration, but also really crucially, allowing us to present as a united front to outside actors, and particularly those actors in the funding and political mainstream, which are going to be so important to get on side and to legitimate ourselves to, if we're going to affect the social change that we all care so deeply about. Being able to kind of say, hey, we are a cohesive movement, and this is how we relate, and this is how we support one another, and how our work sort of supports and legitimates one another, is going to be really, really powerful for us to be able to do that. So I'll speak a little bit more as to how we think this might work, but for the moment, just to say, this is kind of the motivation underlying this.
Yeah, so if you maybe just take us to the top of the screen. I mean, so in essence, the project is about collecting, as it said, the kind of network mapping of actors, organizations, people as well. Can you scroll to the very top actually for the moment, Theo? And the other aspect is it kind of the key features and the ideas. So one of the things we want to do is actually, if you come into this whatever this space is, we kind of say there are maybe several different spaces interconnecting. There isn't yet a unified one in some sense. There are a lot of ideas or kind of even terminology that can be pretty, I don't want to say alienating, but certainly unknown, like, that you might not know about. Like, Metamodern is one just in itself, but there are many others that kind of go on, sovereignty, I could list off a bunch of them that kind of get thrown around and that maybe aren't familiar. And finally, I think the other key point at the moment is, how does this relate or connect with other ecosystems that already exist? What are the ecosystems that are connected to this or that it's coming out of? Just an example, there might be like engaged Buddhism, there's engaged spirituality in one area. There's people interested in, there's the kind of Web3 and blockchain and more collaborative governance. There's people interested in new economic models. There's people interested in psychedelics and, therapy and transformation, etc. There are these different existing spheres, which I think certainly some of those connect with this area, but how do they connect and how is it distinct? I think one of the things that we're also really early in, and is difficult with what I kind of want to say is like preliminary, but we think is valuable. And as you show the mapping of the space, is trying to actually visually, like when you just have like, I don't know, there's 100 organizations, or what is this space? What is this elephant that we're feeling? So we've done some degree of visualization. Maybe if you click on show all the labels for a moment, which will maybe not, it's not so, and then just, it's difficult to read, but like you start to kind of get, this was an attempt to kind of understand the space in terms of like, are the organizations focused on systems change? Are they focused on cultural change? Or are they focused on inner change as a route to kind of overall improving society? And I think that that's like, for those from an integral background, you can kind of see that as like a kind of part of the Wilberian, maybe quadrant version with, you know, bottom right, lower right, and upper left as one aspect. We're playing around with different ways of visualizing to try and get a feel on like, where are people? The other thing you can see here is that in the legend is the kind of types of activity people get up to. Is it politics? Is it about the future of work? Is it about spirituality? Is it about inner development? Is it about governance? We have other visualizations on the site that we won't go through all of them today, but like trying to kind of go down. And finally, I want to maybe, I think the biggest like insight, at least for myself, out of this work, like that I've been getting out of the collaboration with that we've been ongoing and discussing with the different people contributing to the project, is a preliminary definition of what we think kind of defines or helps define this ecosystem. And of course, this is like everything else here, preliminary and up for debate. But there are three, we call it, the way we remember it at the moment was we call it PI. It's paradigmatic, it's integrated, and it's engaged. So if you're trying to explain to someone, let's say who's a classic, let's say you're trying to talk to someone who's like a classic funder, you know, or a classic government person, or just someone who's interested, this is about, it's an ecosystem about social change ultimately. It might not to them, but ultimately people want a really different world, you know, but the approach to it, what distinguishes it from other approaches like building a hospital or much of the other activity, philanthropic activity that goes on today, is this point of being paradigmatic. It's seeking a paradigm change, not simply improvement. It's about an integrated model, the inner and the outer, systems work and inner work, and it's engaged. It's not simply thinking about it. It's not theorizing the academy. It's practical. People actually engage in action. And those are kind of, after quite a lot of internal debate, that at the moment is our preliminary, like that's, if you're looking at an organization, you know, let's say you looked at an organization, would it be kind of quote unquote in the ecosystem? That would help you like kind of to some degree say, okay, yeah, yes or no to some extent. So yeah, and I mean, not that one wants to create very clear lines, but obviously people have come and said, you know, would Greenpeace be part of this or something? And to some extent, some might say, yes, it's engaged, it wants a really dramatic change, but is it, for example, integrated? Does Greenpeace think that inner change is really important versus, you know, that kind of systems change? Anyway, maybe that's a good point. I don't know, Theo, if there's anything else you want to add, or for a moment to start any questions from Peter or anyone else to kind of probe us on what we'd like to explore further.
Yeah, I think I can. Let's open up. There's more I can certainly speak to, but if there's anything pressing, and otherwise I'll.
All right. So I'll stop sharing the screen, and if you have any questions, start throwing them in the chat now, or maybe raise that little hand icon, and I'll warm up Rufus and Theo with a question or two. Yeah, you know, I'm curious with the if you can say a little bit more of life itself as an organization. There's a lot of cool stuff it seems to be doing, like praxis hubs and stuff. And so why is this project like best situated under life itself?
Yeah, so great question. Life itself basically is a little bit like we're overall is like a community. And within that, there are like different activities that life itself kind of people kind of get up to. One of the major ones is practice hubs, which is like space, you know, we could call them deliberately developmental spaces or deliberately developmental progress places for kind of sustained multi-dimensional inner growth. And that, as you say, we're doing work. There's a hub near Plum Village here in France, in Bergerac. There's one in Berlin. There was one in London before. And the other side is what we have called Life Itself Labs. And this Life Itself Labs is more like the research and kind of, I guess, advocacy arm, the think kind of more like contemplation tank segment of life itself. And one of the things I guess we think is, if you're trying to create, we want like to pioneer a wiser future. One part is obviously creating like micro ecosystems that are like, test driving that future, that are trying out different ways of being and organizing. But the other part is weaving a wider movement for change. And obviously there are many people contributing to that kind of activity and helping to weave it. But that's why we got involved there. And also just for practical, so that's where we got involved. And it's in collaboration, I said, with several partners now who've come on board, who we're collaborating with, including the Mindfulness Initiative, Emerge, Thomas Bjorkman, and so on. And the final point is a practical point. I don't know other people here, but it's not easy at the moment when you start out in the space. And we started in 2015 to actually find other actors, or we've talked to other, like, for example, spiritually engaged communities. They're like, do you even have a web page that introduces this kind of space and its kind of features? So in my experience, it's actually at the moment, it's not actually it's quite difficult to even find people or kind of discover key aspects of it. And that this is like an introduction to it. So in some sense, we kind of wrote it, but kind of created it for ourselves as a kind of shared online directory of people we'd come across. To some extent, that's another aspect for ourselves. But it is a project, Life Itself Labs. We do research, and we're, in fact, we should mention that we're just launching a whole project on Web3 and kind of crypto and collective sense making around that. So we do research and kind of cultural advocacy.
But I can maybe speak a little bit more kind of anecdotally to Rufus's point around the kind of this vast iceberg sort of floating below the surface a little. So like I joined Life Itself in October of 2020. And prior to that, I would have considered myself sort of a very progressive and, dare I say, even like radically progressive young person, very kind of politically and socially engaged. And I'd heard almost next to nothing about any of this stuff. Like, it was really striking to me, having kind of stumbled across a job ad for Life Itself, and then coincidentally kind of going down this rabbit hole, sort of popping into this whole world of radically different approaches to social change. Like, prior to this, I kind of knew about the Marxists and the radical left and effective altruists. I kind of joke that I'm a recovering effective altruist, because prior to that point, that was what I could latch onto. And it was really striking to me kind of, going down the rabbit hole, and there were complex systems people in the same room as engaged Buddhists, in the same room as technologists, in the same room as kind of like holistic environmentalists, all getting kind of quite excited about the same things. And it was this really kind of interesting inquiry of, okay, there's something sort of actually quite huge and quite important here that seems to be engaging momentum, but hasn't yet kind of crossed over into broader society where, progressive young people like myself can very easily access it. But also there's this kind of nebulous constellation of people that at the surface might look quite different, but are all seemingly, at the same gatherings and kind of, the same web events. I dare say if we did a straw poll of people here, we'd be coming from kind of different flavors, but coalescing around kind of these same principles. So I think part of it was just, we identified that this was all kind of the case, and that there was this energy, and that therefore it would be a really high value add to start this kind of process off and to get the ball rolling from, our own experience. And, my own experience anecdotally, I know Rufus was sort of previously involved in movement building around kind of open data, and sort of had noticed a very similar thing occur. But we're by no means kind of saying, it's us and only us. We really want this to kind of be an open and participatory effort. And we think that's the only way that it will really fly, is if we kind of have sort of buy-in, engagement and participation to cover the blind spots, which we know we have. But we kind of initially identified that there would be this need, and it would be really valuable to kind of start this ball rolling.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how you described, Theo, the just like the rabbit hole onboarding that a lot of people get in this space, and I think that's quite true. Maybe I'll sneak in one more question. Just to share, I really love the pie stuff. I think that feels right. Maybe I'll share this question. In the past, I don't know if this applies now, but like sort of the through line that I use as a heuristic, to like see what's like the similar vibe, was that people were touched by Ken Wilber's work, for example. That one seemed pretty kind of consistent, like from Rebel Wisdom to Extinction Rebellion to the Metamodern folks. That seemed like kind of like a consistent through line. I don't know if that applies throughout, but I'm curious, through your investigation, was there like a consistent philosopher or consistent theme throughout that kind of like connected everyone?
So first of all, it's just a really great point. And certainly, I've been, I think it's Wilber in lots of ways, it's really brilliant and a big influence. I think there are kind of two things that, just to say a preliminary thing, one thing we'd like to do if we had more resource or kind of volunteers or resourcing in this is to run a proper survey. Like, and we actually have like the survey questions written out. And one of them is, who are your kind of, I don't want to say whether it's intellectual or spiritual or whatever influences in this area. The thing is, it's kind of difficult. Some people you can tell, right? Like you read Hansi Freinacht, if you read, you can guess, and obviously there's a long footnote where they sort of acknowledge why that they were, and if you talk to them, you know that it was even more central, Wilber, in their work. Like then it's not even cited. I sometimes say Wilber seems to be this like dirty uncle in the attic sometimes in this community. Like he's kind of like this incredibly influential figure, but people don't, for whatever reason, we could get into that, sort of not as acknowledged, I think, sometimes as he should be, or the movement around him, or the people, all the people around in integral space who may contribute to him. It's not just him. But so yeah, I would say that showed up, but often just from people's website or other things. Some of the people we talk to the organization, I would say consistently that comes up. Whether it was a pretty major moment that the Integral or Wilber's work was influential, but it's not so. Let me take, for example, I would say, I live next to Plum Village. I'm a Zen Buddhist. I'm that tradition isn't necessarily like highly influenced by integral work, right? Like, but I would actually say, or the mindfulness community, we have a big collaborator with Jamie Bristow at the Mindfulness Initiative in the UK. I'm pretty sure he's aware of Wilber, but it's not like a major influence on the mindfulness community. And one of the things I'd actually say is that expanding some of the like what I'd call the Metamodern community, like seeing these connections with these other groups, for example, engaged spirituality, or even eco villages and other things who often aren't, it's like a huge kind of connection point to be like, hey, we actually share a bunch of aspirations and vision. And one of the other things, people just talk the same language. Like if you know integral, right? If you know Wilber and integral, there's a whole language you have, but which is actually kind of like in Buddhism, you've got relative and ultimate dimension. You've got certain other terminology that kind of you need to translate. So to answer your question, we haven't seen like one litmus person who's like, this is the influence on people, necessarily. But I would say that Wilber and integral is pretty big, and it's like one of those things, once you've read Wilber, you never go back. There's like a sort of like gestalt shift to how you see a lot of things.
And I guess just to come in and complement that a little, I think what we've noticed so far from our preliminary work is kind of less like particular works, maybe kind of with the exception of Wilber and a couple of others aside, that run through, but more kind of like thematic characteristics. So we've outlined these a little bit again, and we've kind of narrowed them down at a first pass to what we might call like post-individualism. So this idea, that we should look at kind of groups rather than just individuals as a kind of unit of analysis, but also kind of a commitment to operating in a bit more of like a networked and communal way than maybe in more mainstream societies and mainstream organizations. Holism, and we spell it with an H to kind of signify the dealing with wholes, but kind of the holistic approach, but also this like understanding of the world in more of like a just out object. And I think this is a really interesting example on this holism point of where different languages are kind of used around sort of quite a convergent point. So again, something I found really interesting in integrating into the space is you kind of had like integral by Wilber, and then you kind of had the complex systems terminology that you might see by the Vicsteinians and others, and then you have like Buddhist interbeing and sort of like which all actually kind of point in a vaguely similar direction, but use kind of different frameworks and different languages to point there. And this kind of holism point is like captures a core characteristic, but I think is a really nice example of where joining those dots and saying, hey, this is maybe why you guys agree with each other and can be used to support one another is really valuable. And kind of just the final core characteristic that we noted, as well as holism and post-individualism, was what we've termed culture making. So this idea of kind of like, you know, pushing past traditional cultural norms and then shifting kind of like the foundations, worldviews and assumptions of our society. So I think, again, something really interesting that I found here was not only kind of challenging the cultural norms of perhaps mainstream society, but even sort of more traditional progressivism at times. And, you know, we can have a debate around the you know, validity of that, and, you know, there's controversy at times, but this idea that actually we need to push past what you might call like green and integral terms, and people sort of experimenting with different ways of doing that. So those were some of the core threads we've encountered, but it was more those than kind of like specific authors and specific works.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I was internally chuckling at the Ken Wilber being the uncle in the attic comment, and it's like, even though the Stoa has a Stoic influence and I have a Stoic vibe here, like when I read Ken Wilber when I was like 17 or 18, it touches you in a certain way, and it's like you never go back, and you kind of almost notice people who, you know, have been touched by him in a similar way, or his work. And I think there's various different onboardings that you can get to this, that kind of that tripartite that you mentioned of interchange, systems change, and culture change. But it seems like he was one of the first that kind of had that high level view of it. So yeah, I think that's cool to sense into more. But let's pivot to some Q&A. Brandon, you had a question or a share.
Yeah. So, you know, you guys have that triangle there, and that's pretty awesome, showing, you know, individual change, cultural change, systems change. And then, so we're talking about, you know, Wilber and the connection there. And, you know, of course, within Wilber, he essentially alternates between using the triangle model and the you know, quadrant model. And I would imagine that if first, you know, you wouldn't have to do this, but if for some reason you wanted to get a little more granular, you could take that what is currently the systems change and subdivide it to acknowledge that there is a little bit of a difference between a change of, you know, something a little more insular, like an institution or a technology platform, which can be, you know, probably better understood in those terms, and like that sort of like upper right, so to speak, right, as opposed to the whole systems change, lower right, which is still, you know, empirical, but it's not something where you're ever gonna fully understand the system. So you use different sort of systems thinking there. So that's one possible way in which you could get to more granular. But, you know, since I even though you're saying you're going with a Wilberian sort of model or something close to that, I mean, it goes all the way back to ancient times. The triangle works just as good, you know. Just wanted to mention that.
Totally. I mean, just to say, it's one way, like what you're trying to do is, let's say you have like 80 or 100 organizations. At the beginning, it's sort of like, it's what I call almost a Vicsteiny like similarity. You know, you're picking organization you know about, and then you start asking this question, you know, how do we map them? How do we understand this? Like, what could we, you know, once we've got all of these examples of like tables, what is it that kind of starts to, you know, define table for us? And there are other visualizations. This was one kind of Wilber or quadrant inspired approach. And obviously, I'm also come from a visualization background. Obviously, visualizations, unfortunately, normally have to be in 2 dimensions. So you have an issue which is strictly any given organization could sort of have this 4-dimensional like vector, which is where they are in kind of like in a, you know, upper left, lower right, upper right space. You know, how much are they emphasizing that aspect of social change or that approach to social change? And we need to get that sort of down to 2 dimensions to be able to plot it in 2-dimensional space. So essentially what we've done is we threw out the upper right, and I'll come to why we did that. And then what we did is we make them sum to 1. We say for any given organization, it's kind of a weighting. Your vector has to sum to 1. You have to be, you know, as an organization, are you emphasizing inner? Are you emphasizing kind of cultural, collective inner, or are you kind of emphasizing systems? And what's your weighting between those 3 things of your overall effort? So that's how we get the 2-dimensional map. That's how that map gets built. To say the upper right, let's try and make this concrete. So let's say we're talking about climate change or climate crisis. Like a pure upper right kind of type solution would be, we're just going to invent better solar. You know, I know there's some systems aspect of better solar systems, but it's like, we're going to fix it because we're just going to get awesome solar. And then like a kind of crudely, I would say systems or kind of formal institutions, formal system solutions, like we're going to create a global carbon budget and carbon pricing and carbon credits and trade them and so on. And then lower left is, you know, we're going to create you know, a culture that really values the ecosystem and so on. And then inner is you're going to have this inner growth, and you're going to realize your inner being. You're going to realize how you're interconnected with everyone else and the planet. And, you know, that will lead to action in the other spheres, basically, or support for action in the other spheres. I mean, one point just to make is, I think part of we call it kind of integrated, to just not be too, some people don't like integral or whatever, but kind of call it, I think it's more accurate, integrated approach is clearly you need some degree of movement, all of them, right? That's kind of probably obvious, that it's not like one on their own is going to succeed. But I think there's an aspect of your emphasis. I mean, this is a life itself. I love the other analogy we have. It's like you need two hemispheres of your brain to function, right? If I cut out one of your hemispheres, you're going to have a difficulty operating. Yeah. But which of your hemispheres crudely has kind of primacy? You know, if you're very left hemisphere oriented, you know, very analytical, you know, very breaking things into parts. If you're kind of right hemisphere, it's like a gestalt. The right hemisphere still needs language. It still needs the left hemisphere. But if it has primacy, it's sort of it. So I think so what we came to, just to finish on this, was I think most of the people in the space don't think that, like, technology is clearly useful and important, but that's not the primary motor of social change. That's what actually distinguishes them. Most of our society is technologically obsessed. It thinks most of the solutions to problems we have in the world are somehow based in technology, you know, bigger, faster, more efficient. And what distinguishes some of the space is a much greater emphasis on the other quadrants, or even a primary focus on them. So that just explains why we dropped that upper right kind of area, for both kind of pragmatic reasons of visualization, but also because actually many organizations in the spaces don't, they're not about building better solar, basically.
Any shares, Theo, or follow-up, Brandon?
Nothing for me. Just lovely to see you here, Brandon. And thanks so much for the interesting comment, and look forward to catching up again soon.
Yeah. And well, on the note of the you know, metamodern sort of technology, that is something we're working on. I agree with what you were saying, is you know, the visualization aspect and the pragmatic fitting it in there. But yeah, some of us are working on technology platforms.
So I guess one further kind of elaborating point maybe, and I'd check with you, Brandon, if this sounds right, is kind of, or feels right even, what we're trying to sort of convey through this, and again, really hasten to add, very preliminary map, is less kind of like what people are working on, but more kind of what they see as the kind of core lever for change that they're contributing to. And those two things might come apart, right? Like I might be building an app, but actually my app targets like inner development. Like, you know, I know Thomas Bjorkman has a project that basically fosters inner development through technological means. Or I might be building an app and in the hope that kind of like, you know, we have a new economic infrastructure built on the blockchain, and that sort of changes our economic system. So kind of, we thought that we could actually group into these broad three categories a lot more neatly, even if people kind of might be working on, for example, technological infrastructure or things like that. So I don't know if that's a helpful further explanation.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. Sarah, you had a question. Your audio is quite quiet. Yeah, there you go.
So thank you. And so as I was saying, nice to see all the work that's been done by Life itself for the past 2 years. And my question, and actually the meta question is it relevant? Like I've been finding myself in the past year in many different communities working on social change embedded in different paradigms, like indigenous paradigms, sometimes social Catholic. And the thing is, every time people are using words about the left brain, like, for example, hurt or love, like they mean something extremely different. And the thing is, it seems we don't have the words to describe the paradigm and also the shadow, corresponding shadow. And I really find it super hard to differentiate what's being done and what's really the inner work explained. And we don't see much things. So I was wondering, are you trying actually to do a kind of intellectual infrastructure to, and maybe it's not a good idea. So that's why to kind of classify in which paradigms are these different initiatives or not, or do you think it's relevant or not?
So can you say a bit more, like, you mean what paradigm they're in? What do you mean by the paradigm they're in, or the language you mean they're using? Yeah, just to help me make your question. It sounds a really good question. Just make it a bit more. I make sure I get it.
So, for example, with Kleber From, who is working right now for the Human Revolution, the projects underlying one is Tamkin project, which is focused on seeing human potential, but rather in a Muslim paradigm at the beginning. And in comparison, there is a whole project based on Ubuntu in South Africa of education, and each time, like it's a different, like each of these projects will talk about, for example, love or other kind of values, but you can feel it means something different, but usually it's never explained. And when you use the Zen Buddhist paradigm, I guess it's again different. Same for social Catholic. Do you see?
Totally. So I think, well, this is like a deeper. So I mean, there's a deeper question, which is that just the like even this space here that's being kind of, we're all curating, is a space where we kind of do sort of some degree of collective sense making, or kind of collective mutual understanding or alignment on what we mean. So, and I think that is particularly, like, it's a particular challenge when we're talking about these kind of concepts, like, and in any given area. I mean, in Buddhism, there are whole, what is true love? It has these four, the four immeasurable, it's four immeasurable minds. There's, compassion, equanimity, love, etc. There's this. So I think that is useful over time. Like, I don't think there's any true answer to what is love. Like, people can, but at least saying, oh, this is what you mean by love in this way. And here, and particularly, where are the commonalities? I think one of the big things at the moment is, like, where do we agree? There might be things we don't agree on or whatever in it, but there's so much that we do often in the aspirations of these groups. I mean, just to go back, I said earlier about, eco-villages or intentional communities or engaged spirituality. I think there are really rich ways where, like, a lot of spiritual traditions, in constructive ways, we can say, look, you guys have really got waking up. I mean, I wouldn't put it in these terms then, but you've really nailed, like, waking up. You're talking, and so what about growing up or cleaning up? And I think many progressive spiritual communities already have had practices like that for even hundreds or 1,000 years. Maybe they haven't called them under that category, or they're adopting those. Many of the counters of, like, Zen, at least I know in the States over the last 40, 50 years, is enriching Zen with, like, cleaning up practices in some areas, like shadow work and kind of psychotherapeutic work. What about with growing up? So I think it's two kind of answers. One is, I think, dialogue. It's maybe like, I don't like the term definitions. It's not like there's a definition of love, but, like, constructive mutual dialogue between different traditions in pursuit of, like, particularly talking about what we share in our aspiration is really valuable. I also think what I kind of call, like, a French English dictionary is useful. The other thing I think that we actually explicitly state is a kind of wider goal, maybe not of the mapping project, but more generally, and in the piece I've posted in the chat about cultivating an emerging paradigm, is, like, a shared language, or at least a shared dictionary. Because I think that at the moment is an obstacle to maybe sometimes different groups realizing how maybe shared their worldview or shared their approaches. And even point to why I think Peter earlier just said about, like, why is Wilber such a touchstone in the community? Because it kind of provided this incredible shared language. Maybe there were things that, like, in a way, Wilber's this great synthesizer, right? I think he'd even say it's not like trying to be per se original. He's trying to go around to say, like, what truth is there in each of these areas, and how do I how do I kind of map it together? You know, he loves these kind of like maps of like different traditions and how they all line up against each other. And I think that kind of translation is super useful, and it's kind of like powerful, because people suddenly, wow, there's actually a lot here that kind of unifies us.
We're playing a mute take, Theo, any thoughts on that?
I guess briefly, yeah. I mean, it really comes back to us for kind of this being a practical tool first and foremost. You know, I think you could do multiple PhDs across sociology, anthropology, etc., and so on, about kind of this ecosystem and the kind of the ones that border it, our shared uses of language and things like this. But aside from the, I think, very real concern of kind of the, you know, in McGilchrist terms, the kind of left-brainist obsession with sort of categorizing for categorizing sake, I think there's also just kind of what's going to be the biggest sort of value add in terms of use of resource, particularly given we're operating under finite resource conditions, as I'm sure we can all empathize with on this call. And so I think that point, just to really bring back that Rufus touched on, of like where the coherence lies and where people are kind of like using different language to point to the same thing, is, I think, really an area where we kind of see one of the highest kind of levers, sort of points of leverage for having this project advance the broader ecosystem goals, because it's through that we can start to kind of strategically align our efforts and say, oh, okay, we're kind of working towards the same thing. But also, I think, then present this more united front where we don't have to keep legitimating what we're up to again and again to people that don't get it, because actually we're doing that work together. So there's this concept in the social sciences of discourse coalitions, where it's people that can kind of, they might have slightly different overall objectives, but they can come together around kind of this shared point to affect social change. And I think one of the, particularly with the language point, we see that as a tool for bringing about these kind of coalitions. So we can say, hey, you know, I don't have to make the case to you for why, you know, cultural shift towards interbeing is important necessarily, or it's not such a strong case, because my friend over here has already made a really good case grounded in evolutionary biology, and my friend over here has made a really good case grounded in kind of complexity science, and all of us are kind of supporting one another's shared efforts, even if kind of like our overall approaches, flavors are slightly different. So that's kind of like the real area of value adds that we hope to bring, and there are others, but just to really say, we're kind of having practical tool first and foremost, and then kind of like, you know, the fun researchy things, I'm sure. If we can have time, we're massive nerds, Rufus and I, so maybe we can fit those in. But
I want to come back maybe just to what one, maybe if there's more, we'll come to more questions. Just the one thing I want to kind of maybe come back to, that this, if that's okay, Peter, just to kind of emphasize that. I just want to ask you, I think the example, who here has heard of, you know, maybe put a hand up or say in the chat if you've heard of effective altruism now, as a kind of, yeah, like, and I think there's something like, first of all, I think there's loads of really amazing things about effective altruism. But just take an example I've noticed of just doing hiring out of like elite universities, certainly in Europe over the last few years, is like a lot of people, the kind of people who are hungry to make a difference, they don't have a lot of options. Like, I hope I'm not offending, but it's traditional kind of Marxist socialism maybe will make a comeback, but isn't a super credible position. For a lot of people, like pure like social justice worrying of like, you know, you shouldn't use, you know, politically incorrect terminology. You know, there's a certain mileage to it. There is a value to like correcting, like dealing with the patriarchy in those ways. But a lot of people are like just hungry, and a lot of them, I'd say, like effective altruism, which is kind of not, it's not like that innovative ideas, right? We want to make the world better, and we want to do it in an efficient way. But it's like become a whole movement, including with like significant funding. You know, it's got a home forum like Less Wrong, or, you know, the State Card Codex, and you know, now, like, often because it's very connected to tech and Silicon Valley for reasons we could go into, but you know, it's got hundreds of millions or tens of millions of philanthropic funding. Like, it's become a whole movement, right? And it's right, and it's a way of thinking. I'm not saying, but imagine we had, like, I don't know, pragmatic utopianism. It would have a different flavor, right? You know, one of the things about if I could critique it, and I think there's great things about effective altruism, but it's kind of within a slightly rational economic, I'm gonna say man, but human kind of paradigm. There's a certain like, you know, it's not like kind of breaking out of the worldview assumptions, and it's sort of within that like technocratic, we're going to improve the world, you know, like, you know, even in the existential risk, we're going to improve the world. The existential risk, we're not going to cooperate to stop this happening. We're going to solve the control problem with lots of kind of like maths. You know, it's kind of, there's something, you know, imagine we could start creating a movement and people like in universities when they're 20 would be like, oh, I could become a pragmatic utopian. There's this movement called pragmatic utopianism, I don't know, or rigorous idealism, or whatever we want to call it, or metamodernism, you know, whatever this thing is that I'm joining. And that's it kind of like, it has these features. And it promises like this it's like a radical hope, but based not in like, you know, that's realistic, but also idealistic. That's the other thing. And kind of behind the scenes, if the moment it would be, you know, like Theo would never have heard of it. If you go and ask someone, you know, I don't know, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, or whatever the local university, or Berkeley, or anywhere, most of the time I'll bet you they've certainly not heard of Wilber. And they haven't heard of like what's possible in here. And I think that's, if that could transform in the next 10 years, that's one of the things also that like this could, you know, and to finish that point, one is just naming. Right now, I'd love a survey even in the chat of like, what do people call this space? Because that's just a real obstacle. If you don't have a name for what this is, like it's kind of, it's you spend the first 5 minutes of every conversation trying to, oh, it's kind of a bit like this, it's a bit like that, and yeah, it doesn't really have a name. Like it's like a tough one, you know. So that's also, I'm trying to kind of get the exciting big pictures. This is going to be the beginning of a movement, and it would have a movement with certain features. And I love to comment. I mean, maybe it's not a good. I talked to Emil, you know, one of the anti-finite orders. He's like, you know, we're Marx to kind of Wilber's Hegel. You know, which I'm not sure that's the right analogy you might want to have, but kind of there's this aspect that of taking some of this vision, but make it kind of concrete as a social and political movement for change. And I don't mean political like in party political, but I mean in like having a vision for how society can be, that maybe is not fully worked out, but has a concreteness to it. In the same way that kind of, in a weird way, effective altruism has a kind of a political or social vision to it. And I just think, to finish, there's just such hunger actually for people for that right now in our society, such hunger for positive, constructive, pragmatic visions for improvement or radical transformation of our society, since we know we're in a time of crisis.
Yeah, I really like that. And I know like a lot of people in the effective altruist movement, they don't have that inner work piece often, and then they often lead to burnout. They're like really good, like meaning people, but they lead to burnout. And then at least the chapter here in Toronto, they're engaging with a lot of monastery work, like monastery academy and stuff. So there's an interesting intersection happening there. And the other thought that came up was the difference between the term for a scene versus like the kind of the construct for like the thing. Like there's like the rationalist scene or like the liminal web scene, and then like kind of effective altruist seems like a construct that describes like what they're about, like philosophically. And this like pragmatic optimist thing seems like it's on that, like a kind of like, you know, what could we be? And I like the word protopian. That seems like kind of a cool one that's been put around, but I'm curious if anyone in the chat has anything. So let's go to one last question. Michael, you had a question.
Sure, thanks, Peter. So I'm an author, and I'm currently doing research on my next book, which is concerning the transition to some sort of game-based society. And it's not actually looking at what that society might look like, but the transition itself from here to there. So I'm very interested in this conversation, obviously. Part of what I'm observing, and I only had a chance to quickly look at your website regarding the cultivating an emerging paradigm. As you saw in the chat, I have a Marxist perspective, although I no longer consider myself a Marxist. But I do see things from a class perspective, which just looking at that page, it doesn't seem to address any sort of class perspective. And I think this is important because clearly the ruling class, and we can call them a global ruling elite at this stage, is actually sequestering all the Earth's resources and hoarding them, which means that ordinary folks, ordinary people, have limited agency. You know, they don't have either because they don't have access to resources through the money system, or because they don't have power to enact change. It seems that all we're able to do right now is to raise consciousness. And there are many, many groups, it seems, that are doing exactly that. And it's a very important step. So I'm trying to get the whole picture in my head. And just one part of that puzzle is consciousness raising. You know, I remember the Zeitgeist movement. I'm sure you guys have come across them. And there are many other groups out there, even before them, that have been raising consciousness and then seem to slide into the background because they don't have any agency. They can't instigate change. And yes, that, you know, there was a huge enthusiasm behind the Venus Project, the Zeitgeist movement, all these things, and Buckminster Fuller, and so on and so forth. And I agree that we need to inspire the younger generation to want to do some sort of, and I think that's a great phrase. Practical utopianism is a great phrase, and I love it. I also love the tripartite descriptor that you had at the beginning in your slideshow, and that actually, I kind of echo that in the penultimate chapter of my previous book. So I alluded to the fact that I was interested in some sort of SWOT analysis. In other words, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats that we face as a global population in order to understand where we are now and how to overcome the obstacles in the face of the fact that we have a limited timeline in which to achieve our objectives. I mean, obviously Daniel Schmachtenberger observes that we are in a metasystemic crisis, and that if we don't change that trajectory, our time is very limited. And just looking at the website very quickly, as I said, I've only just had a chance to look at it. I can see that you have, you know, here and there like a 30-year timeline for some of these ideas. And it seems to me that the threats to our, I'm talking about the SWOT analysis here, but the threats indicate that we don't have that sort of timeline ahead of us, and we need to identify steps to make change more precipitously.
Theo, do you want to,
Yeah, I'll just kind of briefly, I know Rufus and I both have a lot to say on this one, but thanks so much for your comment. And, you know, really, I think valuable to have the more traditional Marxist perspective in this discourse. I think, you know, I, as a sort of live with a big Marxist, and we have lots of these conversations, I think there's a really kind of steel sharpens steel element to having that perspective, and sometimes it can be lost in our space. So I think in terms of kind of the consciousness raising point, I think what we're trying to do with this project, I would classify as far more than consciousness raising, because I think what's one of the things that we talk about with the characteristics of the space is that a lot of people are up to stuff. They're really trying to concretely design and increasingly, I think, implement models of governance, models of kind of organizational ownership and operations, or sort of whatever they may be, that are going to concretely go out into the world and affect it and affect change. And so I think what we're really trying to do here is less kind of like, you know, let's make people aware, although that is a part of it, but also let's see how we can really align our concrete efforts, and what's the kind of like minimum viable kind of alignment and coalition that we can all work towards, given, as you touched on, that kind of real urgency. And I think one of the things that I would love to come out of this is for us to kind of say, okay, well, you know, as Marxists, you sort of the real focus here is on the sort of changing hands of the economic means of production. And actually, I think quite a lot of us in this space, in various shapes or forms, would say, yes, in many sectors of society, or in fact across it, maybe that does need to happen. But, you know, there are other things that we also think need to come as part of that package, or need to come afterwards. But there are these interim steps, which we all kind of like very much might align on, and we can work towards to kind of better affect change than if we were acting alone. And the same with effective altruists, and the same with other things. So I think it's this strategic alignment of concrete action around kind of whatever the minimum viable coalition is, which I think is the real kind of lever here in this condition of urgency, rather than kind of just making people aware unto itself. And Rufus, I know you've got lots to say, so I'll let you come in at this point.
I'll try to say it. So I think one thing is the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was persuading you didn't exist. We have agency. I'd also say one shouldn't overestimate actually the agency of powerful people. It's actually often a lot less than one thinks. I think the thing that also to get is often it's rather than some elite, we often have this story. It's a bit like we like superhero movies and supervillain movies. We love the elite capitalists, I don't know, meeting at WEF or somewhere else, like, the fact is it's more, there's a system. There's a system, whether we want to call it capital, but there's a system that reproduces itself, that has some good features, has produced some good things and many not good things. I think, and systems, kind of what I call cultural system change. I don't call it system change. By system, I'm talking like paradigm change, which is economic, cultural, social matrix of stuff. It's happened in history. It has. The French Revolution happened. We went from a part dominated by lords, kings, arbitrary, to one of equality, fraternity, liberty. Now, it's far from perfect. There are many things to fit, but I'm just saying we shouldn't, or, I often talk about the slavery as a good example. If you went around in 1700 or even 1750, and you were mainly probably a Quaker going on about the slave trade being like not right, not wrong, unjust, blah, 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 in England or in, or in America, you kind of get laughed out of town. And yet, within 50 to 100 years, at least legal slavery had been abolished in most places. There was, even the American Civil War fought to some extent over that topic. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the agency. And I go back, the agency of just individual Quakers who stood up about these topics. So I just want to kind of sometimes do that, because we live sometimes in times where we think, this is elite, and it's really important we have hope. It's really important we don't underestimate what we can do, not only alone, but together in small groups of us. 10 very organized people can definitely change the world. So I just really want to emphasize that point, because sometimes this aspect that, I'm not saying you were saying that, but we can have the sense of like the system's against us or the elite have all the resources. I'm like, no, and history is on our side. History goes, there are loops where we loop the loop and things go very backwards, but there has been some, if you look through the course of human history, what I would call it sometimes, I call it the Nike swoosh. Human well-being, egalitarianism, and other things probably went down as we switched from gather hunting to agriculture. But from that point, it's probably been some degree of very up and down, but some degree of improvements. And so I'm not saying, I don't want to simplify things. I'm sure there's a lot of critique, but I just want to say that most importantly, we have hope, we have agency. We have the potential to make a difference, and that also the thing that we're working on is difficult because it doesn't always happen it doesn't happen in 10 years, but it happens in a generation or two. Cultural change, often you don't change people's mind on culture, on their values and their norms, but you change their children's views and their children's children, and that's a very different world. So I feel that in that regard, that I have real hope in that construct of the SWOT analysis. And I wouldn't call it conscious, just to emphasize, you're right, it has to be concrete. It has to show up in how we actually live, not some ideas or movies we watch, but how we actually live together, which is why we're so big on building these practice hubs at life itself. Sustained inner development is very different from a peak experience or an intellectual insight.
And do you have like 2 more minutes, or do you have to hard stop right now? I want to sneak in a last juicy question, or potentially juicy question. What came up for me listening to Michael's question and you sharing is like the shadow. What is the shadow, a potential shadow of this scene that we're mapping, or whatever we want to call it? And one came up is power related to agency, like a power literacy. Not only having the agency to get power, but actually seeing and spotting power. And an essay that was quite influential to me was the feminist Joe Friedman's Tyranny of Structurelessness. When you kind of like pretend there's no structure and then there's no power hierarchy, then it just goes underground, it gets dark, and then the elite just recreates itself in kind of like a nasty way. And she noticed that in feminist communities that she was involved with back in the 70s. And so it seems like if that is a blind spot, then it's like, A, you might not get power, and then B, you might just recreate power dynamics that are unhealthy. So I'm curious what you think about that power as a potential shadow, or maybe any other shadows that the scene might have.
Definitely. I mean, I'd love to speak to this initially. As I said, kind of my background as a sort of former, well, no, I'd still say a very kind of radical politics sort of cut my political teeth in SJW land, as sort of Rufus has previously referred to it, and has carried a lot of that quite unashamedly into my work here. And I think that there are, I think we can all agree there are major blind spots in this space, particularly around those power dynamics and how they show up around gender and particularly around race. And I think one of the I was at the Emerge gathering this year, and it was kind of, I think there was literally one black woman in the room who kind of raised their hand and said, "Hey guys, maybe we need to think about this." And it was just quite like a telling visual moment for, I think, this far wider issue. And I think the interesting thing here is, I think this partly comes from, this is, as with effective altruism, when you have stuff which is lots of exciting ideas that are often, done in social changey inclinations and proclivities, etc., you're going to get elite people who tend to often be white, middle class, well educated, etc. And I mean elite as in coming from elite universities in privileged socioeconomic conditions, etc. But I think particularly in our space, there seems to have been quite a justified, in certain cases, reaction against SJW culture. We hear a lot of talk around the green meme and sort of all the rest of it. And yes, that's true. Yes, there has been kind of like, the vast backswing of postmodernism, the kind of vast like over policing of language and things like this to quite like detrimental degrees. But also, there's no way through the political mountain, as to kind of borrow your phrase, Rufus, that you like to talk on a lot and speak to a lot. And this stuff has come up for a reason. It's because it's a massive problem in our society. And we as a scene can't just go, oh no, we can just inner develop our way out of this and sort of sidestep it. And I think this is one of the other points that Wilber makes really well, is kind of, you can spiritually deepen all you want, but actually that doesn't help you clean up, and it doesn't help you kind of gain kind of a broader and deeper structural perspective of the world. There are a lot of gurus that are really racist and really sexist. And we have to acknowledge that we have to do this whole package of work, rather than kind of just this one area and just say, oh, this has all got really messy, this debate around sort of, identity politics and stuff. Let's just not engage with that at all and sidestep it. And so what I would hope, and again, this is a real aspiration, is that, again, in efforts to kind of create and cohere a movement, that's the first step to kind of saying, hey, we're here, this is our flag. And we do want people from different backgrounds to be aware of us and to begin to engage with us. Because I think we touch a lot about the potential for this space to educate and, improve broader society. And I really strongly believe that there are ideas and that there are kind of developments and innovations that we are kind of like co-creating here, which can radically alter and radically improve the society we live in. But similarly, there is a whole lot of stuff out there in the world that we really need to draw on, and we really need to draw in and invite in to support us as a space and as a scene in developing. And the first step to having greater involvement from the sectors of society that we need is them knowing that we're here, and that we can actually make a kind of cohesive offer and sort of open our arms and say, we get it, we know we're not doing well here, please, come and let's have a dialogue about this, and let's progress together.
So, okay, I might just add, if I can, respond. So you asked about the tyranny of structures and about power in dynamics. Ultimately, that question is at the heart of political and social theory in a way, right? How do we have groups, and we need groups to do most of the things we do, to solve collective action problems, to run, have our states, to work, to live together, to work together. And obviously some of it, like growth hierarchies versus dominator hierarchies and Wilber type terminology. I don't think anyone has an answer to that per se. I mean, it's not clear, and certainly no one seems to have built yet groups that really have nailed that. In my knowledge, I think there are certain things you can say about it that would be like let's just get pragmatic for this space or what any group. So one is, I think that inner work, and that can include in the multidimensional, waking up, cleaning up, growing up, is kind of really important, particularly to people who end up having some degree of power in that space. Why in general are Zen masters better? Because they're quite enlightened. It's kind of okay. Still, there might be abuse by Zen masters, let's be clear, or Zen mistresses, but that's one aspect. I think what we should really steer clear of, and which concerns me, for example, in the Web3 space, is a belief that people are going to engineer governance type solutions to these problems. I don't think most of the solution is in that. I think you could screw up, like, let's make a dictatorship. How's that going to go if there are certain kind of obvious things not to do, which is, and also, as you said, like, have no structure. When you have no explicit structure, you just have all these behind the scenes ways of getting stuff done, which leads to this kind of actually de facto, and it's not accountable, it's not visible, and you can't do stuff about it. But I really think that inner work and the multidimensional inner work is crucial. And to finish, to kind of cite a guy, Joe Lightfoot, some people here might know, I think it's great. I know we're having a conversation with him and we kind of talk about this concept of spiritual bouncers, or, there's also a need, like, in a nightclub, there are certain people who you're like, yeah, you could maybe come back when you've sobered up a bit, or, maybe come back to next week, or, you look like you're a bit charged right now, we're not going to let you in. There's a kind of need, and I don't know how to do that skillfully, but like, you kind of need to curate in a skillful way, or like the space that people are existing in collectively. And that kind of course, then who gets to be the bouncers, who gets to decide, all of that. But the ultimate thing I think that is important is we bite the bullet, I would say, and this is me then speaking, is going the structuralist route, like even like mature, like sociocracy, any serious people, like that doesn't work. Like, that doesn't lead to like pure equality. We have to bite the bullet and go beyond the kind of, I would say, sometimes green reaction to any kind of hierarchy, to like, everyone must be equal. Like, well, then you get the tyranny of structurists. People aren't really equal in key regards. So that I think we have to accept, but then like really like make that sometimes visible, make the kind of, and really have a responsibility of those holding power, or holding space, if we want to put it that way, really doing the work for ourselves. And I think just to give you one example at the end that for me, I think is really profound, that relates even to a point that I think Michael brought up or putting in the chat, is kind of, he would mention Daniel Schmachtenberg, and like, let's say things are going to go very badly wrong. There can be a real aspect for me, and I'm going to talk personally, maybe it's in our society, of like, we've got to fix it. We've got to, and I'm like, and where that normally has ended up is a kind of, for me, is like a kind of rushing. And that's like one feature I could really point to that I notice, at least myself, really only comes from kind of spiritual practice, is that like non-attachment, like being with death, meditating on the graveyard. And I know Harry Potter's a bit cheap, but like Voldemort, where does all the suffering come from? Voldemort doesn't want to die. And you read Harry Potter, like most of the stories we have is, and it's like our civilization doesn't want to die. And it's like only when, like Thich Nhat Hanh has a great passage where he talks about like, I'm an activist, but if I can't be with like that, like, I don't have to fix it. Like, however unjust, whatever, these things like will pass, like this kind of like, it's called, in Buddhism, it's called aimlessness, like true aimlessness. I don't need to get anywhere. Like, we're going to make the situation, I can guarantee we'll make the situation worse. Now, the irony is, once we can be in that space, we can act and take action. It doesn't mean doing nothing, but we can act from a really different place. And of course, we don't all dwell in that place all the time. I certainly don't. But I think kind of that kind of aspect for people who take on like a leadership of the future, or whoever in this community, like that kind of those kind of features that I see in really like people who are powerfully in the way of whatever path it is that they're chosen, that's a kind of feature to cultivate, and that you can sense, right? You can sense with people. So just kind of make it concrete.
Yeah, so much good stuff and threads. I keep going on, but let's pause here. Perhaps we'll have another session. And before we close, any parting words you'd like to leave with people here today, or anyone watching on YouTube right now, Theo and Rufus?
Thanks all so much for tuning in. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you all, and just it's so exciting to be a part of what really feels like a burgeoning movement gathering momentum. So really glad for that, and I hope we get to have some sort of good-natured debate with the effective altruist community as sort of a former member myself.
Dialogue.
Definitely plus one to that, and a dialogue would be hugely valuable. And
quick things just in ending. One is, if you're interested in actually spending time, we now run 1 month residencies just to save people. If you actually want to try it out, like there's these practice hubs we mentioned, you go to lifeitself.us/hubs or like lifeitself.us. Obviously, would love contribution to ecosystem mapping. If there are organizations we missed, just drop us an email. We definitely have missed, or you'd like to see on there, or you'd like to participate. There's a web form. We also want to write essays on key thinkers and others in the space and put them up there for introduction to help people kind of come into the space. This could be useful. It could be shared on other platforms. And finally, we're going to launch, if you're interested in DAOs, Web3, crypto, or whether you're a critic or you're excited, we're launching a new collective sense-making initiative on that. Check out lifeitself.us/Web3, but that's like launching this week or next week in a big way, with a lot of essays and conversations like Jordan Hall, Stephen Reed, but also some really amazing kind of people who've got critical view on the space as well. So look forward to that, and I'd love to talk with anyone more. I love collective sense making, as you can tell. So it's just been a real, I want to end with a thanks for everyone's presence, time, attention, questions, and Peter for creating this kind of space and community. And really, yeah, it's a privilege to get to participate. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you for coming today. A lot of exciting stuff. And you guys, I sense you're at the edge of a lot of different things and a lot of different potential there at Life Itself. So looking forward to seeing what emerges there, and happy to have you back at the STOA anytime. Yeah, and so if any other events, feel free to check out at the stoa.ca. We got a bunch coming up and a bunch to be posted soon. So that being said, Rufus, Theo, and everyone, thank you so much for coming to the STOA today.
Thank you.
thanks so much, everyone.